أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
الحمد لله رب العالمين. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الحديث حديث محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. أو كما قال. يقول الله سبحانه وتعالى بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. ونزلنا عليك الكتاب تبيانا لكل شيء وهدى ورحمة وبشرى للمسلمين. The ayah is in Surah Al-Nahl of the Quran, the 16th chapter, the B. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks, and we have sent down to you, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the book, meaning this Quran, as a clarification of everything, as an explanation of everything, so that we may explain all things. And in this Quran also, there is guidance, wahuda. This guidance is not for everyone. Earlier in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specified that this guidance is only for specific people. The guidance is for whom? Hudan lil muttaqin. Those people who approach the Quran with taqwa will get guidance from it. Those who approach the Quran with arrogance will never get guidance from the Quran. They both are reading the same book. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that those people who get guidance from this Quran are not perfect. So they will make mistakes and error along the line. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also has rahmah, mercy. Wahuda wa rahmah. And this Quran also came down as a glad tidings, also a good news, as a good news for those who submit their will to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَبُشْرَى لِلْمُسْلِمِينَ. Those people who submit their will to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Based on this ayah, inshallah, brothers and sisters, in the next few minutes we will attempt to explain the topic of our khutbah, which is actually the goal of all human beings. Whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim doesn't matter. In fact, even animals, even the jinns, We all have this as a single goal. It is the objective of all human beings. So we will make an attempt based on the Quran, since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says He has the explanation of everything. تِبْيَانًا لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ. We will explain through the Quran, inshallah. Brothers and sisters, what is happiness and contentment? How do we get it? How do we acquire it? How do we reach that level? This has been a question from the beginning of humanity until now. People are interested in it because, of course, we all have that same goal, to be happy, to get content. We might choose different routes to get it, but the goal is the same. We have a group, or we see a group of people who believe that happiness can only be acquired through the acquisition of worldly material. So they spend their whole life trying to acquire as much worldly material as they can. Yet we find another group which says, no, it's not worldly material. We can only reach happiness and contentment through fame. So they will spend their whole life trying to be famous, because they feel that when we become famous, people are trying to be like us. So therefore, we will be happy. Yet we have another group which says no. We only acquire happiness and contentment through the acquisition of power. So they spend their whole life trying to acquire power by any means necessary, whether it's halal or haram way, mostly in haram ways. So they will kill, cheat, steal, do everything in order to not only acquire power, but to stay in power. They feel that power will give them happiness. That's a level of contentment where they get to tell people what to do and so forth. Yet we have another group, and this is a very dangerous group, because this group actually has an effect in the whole humanity presently, which is a very bad. This group believes that we can only acquire happiness through the maximization of bodily pleasure. This is a very dangerous group. And this is why they spend their whole life trying to acquire that. And not only that, but they affect society doing so. Because when I look at, these are the people who not only do, but also promotes all kinds of these bad things, fawahish such as pornography and the sexual revolution. When we look at our today world, in fact in 2006, I believe, the worldwide revenue for pornography was $97 billion. This is a huge amount of money to do what is haram, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not like. So it's a very dangerous group. When we look at even today, regular things, such as, for example, even male-dominated industries, such as mechanics. When we look at the magazine, the front page of a magazine that sells tools for mechanics, we'll see a scantily dressed woman on it, half naked, in order to attract the mind of men. They know that this is the most powerful, important part of the human being, especially for the male. It destroys society. It destroys nation, because it destroys the nucleus of a nation, which is the family. May Allah save us from it. But yet we have another group which says, no, it's none of these four individually, but rather we only acquire happiness or can get the level of contentment through the acquisition of these four. So it's all four, all of the above. You get worldly materials, you get fame, you get power, and you maximize your pleasure, your bodily pleasure, all this by haram ways, then you become happy. And this is the actual philosophy of the modern society, which is not only promoted, but almost forced into each and every one of us on a daily basis. But yet, when we look at people who have acquired all these four or even more, we see that those people are unhappy. Not only unhappy, but they reach what is actually the lowest level, according to the psychiatrists and the psychologists, the lowest level of the brain capacity, which is the level of helplessness, the level of giving giving up because they commit suicide. And we can go and Google it where we can see thousands of people, famous people who have committed suicide, though they were rich, they were famous, they had power, and so forth. Hollywood is a good example of it. And this happened early on, even thousands of years ago. Cleopatra, who was in Egypt, well, at her time, every woman wanted to be like her beauty, the power, and so forth. But she committed suicide. Why? Because that level of contentment and happiness is not there. If we cannot reach that level of contentment and happiness through these means, how do we then get the level of contentment and happiness? We have to go back to the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says He has explanation for everything. Tibyana li kulli shay. When we look at the Quran, we have to first, before we reach the happiness, who are we? We have to know who we are, then we can know how to be happy and how to be content. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِنْ طِينٍ. That indeed we have created human being, al-insan, mankind, with an extract of clay. Extract, the word sulala can also mean the essence of something. When we look at the human being, all of the physical elements of the human being, we find that all of the physical complex of the human being are also found on the earth. For example, zinc. The human body has zinc, he has oxygen, he has hydrogen, he has cobalt, he has iron. All these elements are also found on the earth. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, كُلُّكُم مِّنَ الْآدَمِ آدَمْ مِنَ التُّرَابِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says tin, and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says turab, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses turab as well. Clay, which is the mix of turab, which is dust, and water. So there is no contradiction. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not stop there. He continues talking about the creation of Adam alayhi salam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. That He has breathed into Adam, which is in all of us as well, the ruh. What is the ruh? The ruh is the soul. What is the soul? This question was asked to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam 1400 years ago, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers it in the Quran. It's in Surah Al-Isra. يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. They will ask you about the ruh, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the soul. Tell them that the understanding of the soul, the knowledge of the soul is the affair of my Lord. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala understands it. What is He made out of? Is it physical? Is it non-physical? Is it metaphysical? Does He have a weight? Can we see it? Can we touch it? We don't know those information. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues to let us know that we should not dwell ourselves in understanding all of those about the ruh, because it's not important to us, it does not benefit us. Because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues, He says, وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. About the knowledge, whether it's the knowledge of the soul or knowledge in general, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says He has only given us a little bit. إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. So now, we understand that the human being is made out of two basic elements. One is the physical elements which come from the earth, and the second one is the ruh or the soul which comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In order for a human being to be happy, to be content, the human being has to be contented on both levels, to be balanced. The physical body and also the spiritual body, which is the ruh, which comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we look at this physical body, our whole focus is to give contentment and happiness to this physical body. This physical body comes from the earth, and what pleases it or what make it content and make it happy also come from the earth. Food grows from the earth. The body eats it. It gets satisfied, it gets healthy, it gets strong. The ruh, or the soul, comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a higher level. The same way we feed the physical body from its own source, we have to also feed the spiritual body, the ruh or the soul, from its source, from its own source, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have to create that connection, that spiritual connection between ourselves and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to feed the soul, to make the soul healthy, to make the soul strong. So now with the harmony of both the physical body and the spiritual body, the human being can now reach the level of happiness and contentment, which will be the true contentment. Why? Because the soul is the real me, not the body. The soul comes from an eternal source, so it's eternal. The body comes from a temporary source, so it's temporary. This is why even the happiness and the contentment of the physical body can only be temporary. It cannot last forever. Because the source itself, which is the earth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that He will destroy the earth. At one point, at the end of time, إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْضُ زِلْزَالَهَا. When that happened, in the last shaking of the earth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will destroy the earth. So the body also is temporary and also will be destroyed. The question now becomes, how do we feed the soul? How do we make the soul healthy, and how do we keep the soul healthy and strong and keep that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? أقول قول هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين والمسلمات. الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيبنا وحبيب رب العالمين. أما بعد. Brothers and sisters, happiness and contentment in this world is a sign of Jannah. It is a taste of Jannah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make those who have taqwa taste it on this earth first before they reach Yawm al-Qiyamah. The soul or the ruh comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How do we feed it? How do we make it strong? And how do we keep it strong and healthy? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the answer there. It's there in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, "Ala bi-dhikrillahi tatma'inul qulub," that indeed, certainly, or only with the dhikr is the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it's more than that. Only with the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will the soul, the hearts, reach contentment, reach happiness. This is the level of sakina, tranquility, where the heart is pleased and becomes happy. The soul that we are trying to feed is only fed through the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes further than that. He said subhanahu wa ta'ala actually that without the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I keep the word dhikr, which is remembrance, but we'll get into it a little bit. Without the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you will actually live a miserable life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِ فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً دَنْكَ. That whoever neglects, وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ, whoever neglects, look away, stay away from our remembrance, from our dhikr. Inna, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the word inna to emphasize that for sure, certainly, such a person will live a miserable life, a difficult life, ma'ishatan danka, difficult, full of deceptions and so forth, all of the negative terms. Now what is dhikr? What is the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What is dhikr? Dhikr is, the etymology of the word obviously is to remember. It's actually dhikrullah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to remember Him a lot. وَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. Remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a lot, so you may be successful. And by the way, dhikr is the only ibadah which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically said, do it a lot. All other ibadah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do it moderately. Stay in the middle. We are ummatan wasata, we are in the middle. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, but do my dhikr a lot. There is no prerequisite for dhikr. You don't have to be in the masjid, you don't have to have wudu, you don't have to do anything. You can do dhikr all the time, except in the bathroom. So, dhikr has two components. The first component is the mean itself, which is to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then the second component is what we tend to always forget, which is the end, the goal of it. What is the purpose of the dhikr? The Mufassirun have explained this in several books and books and books. What we have learned from it is that we do the dhikr in order to have a final goal, which is to obey the rules and regulations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to stay away from the prohibitions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the dhikr of Allah. The man or the sister who sits, subhanallah, Allahu Akbar, alhamdulillah, continue this a lot, and he or she is remembering or thinking of his business, her job, his job, her children, his children, and so forth. Is he doing the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Is he truly doing the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The Mufassirun explained to us that the true dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that which we do on a daily basis, on a regular basis, constantly. You see, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do it a lot. Kathira, a lot. He didn't even set any limits. If I'm a businessman, and now I am selling, for example, a car to someone, and I know this car has all kinds of problems, and the brother asks me, what is the problem in the car? I say, you know, brother, the car doesn't have any problem, it's perfect, everything is fine. Just so that I can make a few bucks. Rather than doing that, if I think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'm doing the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells me not to lie, to tell the truth. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu ittaqullaha wa qulu qawlan sadida. Fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those who profess to believe in Allah. Speak the truth at all times. Then you are doing the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If I'm looking for a job and they offer me a huge salary, maybe double of what I'm normally making, and all these perks and so on and so forth, then I find out that this company is selling alcohol, or they're selling lottery. And I remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells me this is haram. That is the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So constantly, in every single step that we take on a daily basis, before we make any decision, before we do anything, we have to think to do the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first and see, is this going to please Allah or not? If it pleases Allah, we do it. If it doesn't, we do not. When a person reaches that level of the dhikr of Allah, this person is feeding the ruh from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So such person now is already happy, because the soul, the happiness of the soul is the true happiness. So when the worldly material comes, the happiness is already there. When the car, the house, and so forth come, the happiness is already there. When the fame comes, the happiness is already there. When such person wants to do anything, he knows that that happiness is there because the soul is the true me. When I look at this, I will say, this is my hand. This is my head. These are my eyes. This whole thing is my whole body. It's my body. If this is my body, I have to be different than this body. Who am I? The owner of this body. And as the owner of this body, which is the I, that is the true soul. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us the soul will go through different transitions. It's eternal. It will go in different transitions. When this body dies, we go into the life of al-barzakh in the qabr, and then we will be resurrected. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كنتم أمواتا فأحياكم ثم يميتكم ثم يحييكم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us the stages of the soul, but the body is only temporary and will go to a temporary place. And when we satisfy the soul, the more satisfied, the more contented the soul becomes, the less and less and less things the body needs. Less material things the body needs. Less fame, less all of these things the body needs. Because the soul is already contented. And when we look at the opposite also, is true. All of the paradigm that we have seen have failed except one paradigm, which is that which was brought to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through his Anbiya alayhim salam, which is the paradigm of Islam, which teaches us to be now truthful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and follow the commandment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we can conclude that all of this can be summarized into one, which is the truth. Be truthful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help you in everything else. Because by being truthful, we will constantly serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By gaining all these non-physical things, when we look at the world today, what join us together, what keep us going is those things that are not physical by nature. They're not physical in nature, such as trust, love, brotherhood, trustworthiness. These are not touchable things. The one who is truthful and sincerely truthful to himself or herself will naturally become happy. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam tells us that the one who speaks the truth will continue to speak the truth until such a person is now being written as truthful by the angels in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that truth will make such a person enter Jannah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those people. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us understanding. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the strength to forgive each other's small differences. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unite us in under La ilaha illallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep us together. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep us as an ummah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep us from all the afflictions that are coming to the ummah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us stay on his path and be content and happy with what he gave us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep us from such things such as riba. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep us from such thing such as enmity and so on and so forth. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد اللهم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار اللهم ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا اللهم ارحمنا بالقرآن اللهم ارحمنا بالقرآن واجعله لإماما ونورا وهدى ورحمة اللهم طهر قلوبنا من النفاق وأعمالنا من الرياء وألسنتنا من الكذب وأعيننا من القيانة عباد الله رحمكم الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون ولذكر الله أكبر وأقيموا الصلاة
الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر